Okay, they say episode 16 is the big episode. That's what I've always read about in podcast publications. So here we are. And of course, we got a doozy to start off with. Judah, last week was Iran. Week before was Venezuela. It's just like Carmen San Diego. Greenland was not on my bingo card. What is the latest there?
Yep, just when you thought it was safe. So over the weekend, President Trump announced on social media that there would be 10% tariffs on a list of countries in Europe that are opposing the sale of Greenland to the United States. And this 10% will go into effect February 1st, and then it will increase to 25% if there's not a sale or a deal by June. And then these EU countries, as well as the UK, are vocally opposed to this situation.
They don't like it.
And they've been saying that, Greenland is for sale for a while, but they seem to be in one voice, and that if there are steps taken or tariffs imposed, they will retaliate. And there's a number of ways they could retaliate. Statements from some of their leaderships that will retaliate proportionally, but there are a lot of different things at their disposal. So there was the tariffs on $100 billion of U.S. goods that were actually approved last year during the escalating period of the trade war, but it was never implemented. It was postponed, but that expires on February 7th. So those can go into effect if the U.S. takes action. They could withhold other parts of the EU-U.S. trade deal that still have to be approved, which is kind of a process like reducing some tariff to zero. They could even close U.S. military bases. And then they also have something called the Anti-Coercion Instrument, which is also known as the Bazooka. And this at the EU's disposal to take various actions when they feel under economic coercion from some other country. And these include other tariffs, putting tariffs on services, limiting the ability of that country, in this case the U.S., to bid on public contracts, limiting intellectual property rights, also controlling exports. So there's a lot of things that they could do, although the message is now is that they're going to be proportional to what the U.S. does.
Oh my gosh. We've seen so many different tariffs coming from, threats coming from different directions. Is this the first time that the EU is deploying the threat of tariffs too? Because historically and more recently, it's mostly been coming from the US.
Yeah, so really in terms of retaliation, like we said, there were this bundle of tariffs approved last year, but that weren't implemented. But in general, the approach last year was more conciliatory and non-confrontational, and trying to arrive at an agreement that this was kind of what a lot of countries, including the EU countries, saw as a better strategic approach. This time, though, it seems to be kind of the sense that the U.S. has crossed a line in terms of the issue with Greenland, and that they now are prepared to actually enter a trade war with the back and forth, as opposed to kind of immediate negotiations and coming at a deal like we saw last time.
And it's just going to be like your guess here, but there's obviously a pretty strong track record of tariffs being discussed and then kind of not really materializing. Do we think that these are actually going to turn into a real tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, who knows? We certainly have several examples of tariffs being announced and then not materializing, or materializing but becoming a law but not being implemented. So, just a couple of weeks ago, we had 25% tariffs on any country trading with Iran. And, this is announced on social media, but it has to become an executive order to actually be law. We had others like this. There was one that was going to be on countries that buy Russian oil. We had one for countries that buy Venezuelan oil. That one actually became an executive order, but as far as I can tell, was never applied. And even in terms of like the reciprocal tariffs on April 2nd, these were announced at a very high level, and they were quickly reduced. So it could be, and it probably is at least a way for the president to push the issue and push negotiations and try and get concessions towards something that he wants, even if it's not the maximal approach like complete sale. So will it actually become an executive order or not? I guess sometimes it doesn't need to in order for it to be a threat, or sometimes it's just abandoned. So once again, it's really, really hard to say.
Taking this a little bit closer to our wheelhouse, what are the implications for freight patterns, right? For global freight patterns and for freight rates when it comes to these tariffs?
Right. So as we saw last year, and as we saw in 2018 and 2019, when tariffs are announced, if there's enough runway before that date, you usually see some front loading before that tariff is implemented, or before that tariff could possibly be implemented, whether or not it actually ends up being. For February 1st, that's not enough of a runway, certainly not for ocean freight. For air cargo, we're not seeing rates change very much on the transatlantic, so it looks like there aren't a lot of shippers kind of rushing to get ahead of February 1st, although there's several days left, so maybe we'll start to see that. If this does go into effect February 1st, and then there's a June deadline, you might start seeing some front loading on the transatlantic. But really, in general, transatlantic is kind of a calmer lane. So you still might see kind of stronger volumes than normal ahead of June. I don't think it would maybe be immediately starting in February because there are a lot of things that in between them, but it's certainly feasible. And overall, you might see lower volumes altogether. So if the EU and the UK implement tariffs as well, and you're going to see possibly reductions in those trade in those volumes for ocean and air as well.
Okay, and jumping over on our map from Northern Europe all the way down to the Red Sea, we've been talking for a while now about the potential return to the Red Sea, and I know that there's more robust testing of waters going on right now. Are we close to the end? Is the Red Sea back?
Yeah, so kind of mixed signals. So CMA CGM has been sending some vessels through really for, I think, starting at some point in 2024. They're already sending vessels, usually with a naval escort. They're the first ones to send an actual service through or parts of the service through. And Maersk had sent a couple of test vessels and then announced last week that they're going to be sending one of their India to Middle East to U.S. East Coast services completely back through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. So those are all signs in the right of steps in the right direction. Still, it's only these two carriers mostly. There are other kind of similar examples. But then just this week, CMA CGM said they're re-diverting one of those services that are meant to go back through the Suez is now going back around the Cape of Good Hope. And they said this is because of an uncertain international context. You know what that means, but I think this is a good sign of steps forward and steps back. And maybe this is an indication that we're not going to see a couple carriers test it and then all of a sudden everyone jumps in, but we're going to see more of a gradual approach, which will actually be kind of less disruptive. If we have some vessels taking a longer route and some taking the shorter route, or maybe some of the backhaul taking a shorter route, or lower value cargo and things like that. So that seems to be the case for now. But are we heading toward the Red Sea return sometime soon? It's still very uncertain and maybe less optimism than there initially was when carriers first started taking these steps.
Awesome. And then, my last question here, normally this entire episode at this point, we are like in peak Lunar New Year prep. We didn't even get to it yet. We're Lunar New Year right now, and what's the impact on global freight rates?
Yeah, so Lunar New Year starts February 17th, and that generally means that manufacturing slows down about a week before that, and you usually see increase in demand in the weeks before then, so that shippers are able to get goods out before there's this basically 3-week significant slowdown, and you have to wait to get goods to move shipments afterwards. And that's kind of what we've been seeing. It started a little bit earlier than usual, but we've seen rates continue to increase up until last week. And then last week we started to see some dip in rates. So that means that carriers did have mid-month GRIs planned. So it seems like those aren't being introduced. That probably means that we're at about peak for pre-Lunar New Year demand. So Asia, Mediterranean fell 5%, 4,600. Asia, Europe decreased 3% to below $3,000. So these are down by a couple $100 from where they were a couple weeks ago. And that seems to say that we're past that peak demand. Something similar for the Trans-Pacific as well. But for Asia, Europe, rates have really just consistently been climbing since mid-October through GRIs, through capacity management, and then through Lunar New Year demand. So seeing them start to level off or dip probably means we're at that peak for lunar demand, and we'll see rates start to ease, when we get a little bit ahead of Lunar New Year. We might see some additional pressure just after, when there's usually some backlog, and then we'll see some seasonal easing of demand, and therefore probably downward pressure on rates too.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Judah. Really appreciate it. Guess we'll see what part of the world we're heading to next week in our tariffs 2026. As a reminder, you can get email updates from Freightos directly in your inbox, which is where people get emails. Apparently, a link for subscribing to there in the show notes. Thanks. See y'all next week.